Hello. In this lecture, we are going to be looking at Chapter 10, Artistic Reflections in the Pre-Modern World, circa 480 BCE, which means before the current era, to 1400 CE, which is the current era. Now, you're going to notice this is a very large chunk of time, and because of this, we are going to have to limit and narrow our focus. So how we're going to narrow our focus is we will actually be focusing mostly on the Western world. Pay attention to the history chapters, as I call them, because I usually don't have you reading the entire chapter. That's because our limited time and scope, we have to narrow down what we're looking at. Now, this is not to say that the Western world was the most important part of the world or that other parts of the world were not important, but just because of time limitations, this is how we are narrowing our scope. Now, each chapter of the history chapters is going to start out, Spore, the author of your text, has at the beginning kind of an overview of what's going on in the world at this time. I do want you reading those sections, and then after that, we'll narrow our focus to the Western world. So, for this one, we are going to start with Europe. Europe and specifically Greece. Greece is very important because it was one of the first cultural centers of the world, meaning it was a place of flourishing art, politics, religion, and we're going to see this specifically in Athens. During this time period, we had the Golden Age of Athens. Eventually, Sparta does defeat Athens in the Third Peloponnesian War. However, Greece did still remain the cultural center. Alexander the Great eventually is going to usher in what's called the Hellenistic Age, which we will talk about. And then after Alexander's death in 323, Rome begins to emerge as the cultural center of the world. And so this is where we're going to see a shift from Greece to Rome. Augustus, 63 BCE to 14 CE, was the first Roman emperor, and he actually turned to Greek classicalism for inspiration. That's why when we look at classical Roman art, we're going to see it reflects the classical Greek art, and it's for this reason. They thought Greece was the great, and they looked to them for inspiration. Now, after Rome falls to the the Goths in 476 CE, this ushers in what is known as the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages. And that is about a 1,000-year time period, which is from the fall of Rome in the Western Empire until the Renaissance. And in fact, it was the people in the Renaissance who gave the Middle Ages this name. Why? Because the people in the Renaissance, as we'll learn later, they look back at ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and they're trying to revive these ideals. And what they saw in the Middle Ages is they saw this was a time that was dominated by the Christian church. It was a time that was ruled by superstition, and they really didn't think much of anything of importance happened in that time period. And that's why they gave it this idea of the Middle Ages. Now, the Byzantine Empire, moving to the Middle East after the fall of Rome, Constantinople actually became the cultural center of the world. And it was the center of the Orthodox Christianity. And we will look at the Byzantine art in this chapter. Now, also what we're going to see during this time period is the rise of Islam. Muhammad lived from 570 to 632 CE. And what happens within the Islamic world is the Western world actually owes a large debt to the Islamic world, because after the fall of Rome, a lot of the classical texts actually would have been lost, but they had made their way into the Islamic world, and the Islamic world actually kept them alive until the Renaissance, the rebirth, when these texts were rediscovered, if you will, by the Western world. Now, what we see within Islam, we have the 5 pillars of Islam, meaning the 5 main tenets of the faith. These include the belief in Allah, the performing the canonical worship 5 times a day facing Mecca, fasting during Ramadan, which is the 9th month of the Islamic calendar, yearly payment of the zakat, which is money for the poor, and at least once in your lifetime, Muslims are supposed to complete the Hajj, which is the annual pilgrimage to Mecca. All right, in China, we see Confucius, 551 to 479 BCE. He's considered the greatest professional teacher and philosopher within the Chinese history. He was a moralist, and he actually developed an ethic tradition. China at this time is run by the warlords, but what Confucius valued is he wanted a return to ancient ways, and he was much more pragmatic than based on the intellect. And he believed that when looking at a good ruler, what makes a ruler good was their virtue, not their might, not their power. And with a ruler who was a virtuous ruler, this would bring contentment to the people. And then we have India. India in the 6th century BCE, we see the rise of Buddhism, which is both a religious philosophy and an ethics. It's a code and a way of life. Buddha lived from 563 to 483 BCE, and Buddhism is very loosely based on what we call the Four Noble Truths. And this idea is that first, existence is suffering. Second, the origin of suffering is desire, that we as humans desire things, whether it's just things we want or if it's things we actually need, food, water. We are driven by this desire. Well, suffering can only cease when desires cease. And the only way to end desires is actually to reach non-existence, which is called nirvana. And that's the ultimate goal of Buddhism, is to reach non-existence. How you do this is through enlightenment, and you escape existence into the blissful non-existence where suffering does not exist. So that's the overview of kind of what's going on in the world at this time. Now remember, again, this is a very large time span. Now what you're going to see in the rest of the history chapters, you'll see a slide where I have main styles. These are the artistic styles I expect you to know from both the readings and the lectures. You should be able to, if I asked you to define Greek classicalism, you should be able to tell me about the time period it was and what are the main ideas behind Greek classicalism. So for this chapter, we're going to look at Greek classicalism, the Hellenistic, Roman classicalism, Romanesque, Gothic, and then the Byzantine. All right, well, we're going to start with Greece. We are going to start with ancient Greece. In Greece classicalism, this is an artistic style and a cultural perspective based on and associated with the principles and thought of ancient Greece. What we're going to see within this idea is that the Greeks were striving for harmony, for order. They wanted to show reason and intellect, objectivity, and formal discipline within the artworks. And what happens in ancient Greece is that you have this drive to represent idealized perfection instead of real life. And you were going to see this reflected in the artworks of the time. And this idealized perfection also reflects the idea that ancient Greece considered itself as the foundations of civilization. Now we can see some of that within sculpture. Sculpture begins in about the middle of the 5th century BCE, and what we're going to see here is we're going to see with the two sculptures here, we're not looking at an individual, meaning we wouldn't look at this, or the Greeks wouldn't look at this and be like, oh, it's LeBron. Okay? We look at this and we know this is the idealized form, so the discus thrower or the lance bearer. These are the two you see here. These are not individual men, but this is the idealized form. So this is the perfection of the discus thrower or of the lance bearer. And you see this within the works. You also, as we go on in later Greek works, we're going to see more of a sense of movement. And you can see this in the discus thrower who is in the top right. And then we're also going to see what's called contrapposto. Contrapposto is a stance. And what this is where the body's weight rests on one leg. And what this does, it results in a sense of relaxation and controlled dynamics. It makes a very subtle play on the curve. So if you look at the lance bearer, who is the lower image, you can see he's standing in contrapposto. All the weight is on that right leg, which puts that half of the body in tension. The other half is more relaxed because it's not supporting it. And what this does is it gives the works a much more lifelike appearance. And you can see it in this little comic here, because if we look back to ancient Egyptian works, we almost always saw the images as they're shown here, very stiff, very formal. Yet here in the middle, the figure who is standing in contrapposto looks much more relaxed, much more lifelike. All right. Also important in ancient Greece, in Greek classicalism, was the theater. And this was what was called a theater of convention, meaning there was no scenery or costumes at first. This was very freeing for the artists. What happened is the playwright would give a description, and then the audience must imagine it on their own. Usually plays were written as part of a religious festival, and it usually was some sort of competition. Almost all Greek plays used the chorus, which the chorus was a group of individuals, usually the narrator was part of it, and then different characters would come out of the chorus, play their role, and then go back in to the chorus. Now, usually these plays were written in groups of 4. You would have 3 tragedies followed by a 4th comedy or a satyr play. And here's some different examples of some of these. An example is probably Aeschylus, who was the most famous of the Greek poet and playwrights, 525 to 456 BCE. And he wrote what's called the Oresteia, and this was a collection of 3 tragedies. The first was Agamemnon, which follows the tale of the Greek warrior Agamemnon as he comes home from being gone from the Trojan War for 10 years. And his wife, Clytemnestra, has been ruling in his stead. Well, she and her new lover. And they're not real happy when Agamemnon comes home to take back over. In fact, Clytemnestra is not happy with him because before he even left for the war, the gods told Agamemnon he needed to make a sacrifice in order to be successful in the Trojan War. And the sacrifice was he and Clytemnestra's daughter, Iphigenia. Well, he did it. He sacrificed Iphigenia. And so Clytemnestra is not happy about this. And then also when Agamemnon comes home, he brings Cassandra, a concubine, who back from Troy with him. So what ends up happening? Clytemnestra kills Agamemnon and also kills Cassandra. And that's the play Agamemnon. The second play in the trilogy is The Libation Bearers. And this is where Orestes and Electra, who are brother and sister, and the children of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, begin plotting. Why? Because their father has been murdered, and they need to avenge their father's death. Yet to do this, they have to murder their mother. And so because of this, what you see in the Libation Bearers is you see the struggle, like this idea of what is doing right. Is it right to avenge our father, or do we have to abide by our mother? Eventually, Orestes does kill Clytemnestra and her lover. And then that leads to the third play in the series, which is the Eumedes, or the Furies. And what happens in this play is Orestes is actually put on trial for killing his mother. And eventually, though, he is acquitted because the court decides that the husband is actually seen as more important in the marriage than the wife. And so the children did the right thing by avenging Agamemnon's death. And so what you see in these is we see these lofty moral themes in these plays. Sophocles, probably one of the most famous of the Greek playwrights. He's known for the 3 Theban plays. This consists of Oedipus Rex, Oedipus at Colonus, and Antigone. And now these all were followed up by a 4th comedy, but for the most part, we've lost a lot of these comedies. Aristophanes, though, 448 to 380 BCE, he was one of the first playwrights who pretty much basically just wrote comedies. An example of this would be the Lysistrata. And this is actually based off of historical events. It's talking about the Peloponnesian Wars, which were wars that were fought between Athens and Sparta. Well, what happens in the Lysistrata is basically the women of Athens are sick of this. They are sick of all the fighting and they want it to stop. So they're debating how they're going to get the men to stop fighting. Well, basically what they decide to do is that they are going to withhold sex. And guess what? it works. Because of this, and after some different events, basically peace talks come about, and peace is declared, and everyone celebrates and goes off and does what they do. All right. Moving next, the last thing we're going to look at within classical Greece is the architecture. And again, the architecture is very reflective of Greek classicalism, with this idea of order, balance, clean lines. And we're going to see that very clearly here in the building called the Parthenon. The Parthenon was a temple to Athena, and it sits atop the Acropolis in Athens, Greece. And it is still there. The image that you see here is what it more looks like today. Because of years of pillaging and looting and wars, it was in disarray. Now, when you look at this, looks very clean, looks very orderly. We see these straight, clean lines. We see the vertical columns. But what's interesting in this is actually an optical illusion. There is not really a straight line in the entire work. And the Greeks understood this. They wanted it to appear very clean and simple to the human eye. Now, when the human eye looks at two straight lines next to each other from a distance, they actually begin to curve. So to adjust for this, what the Greeks did, if you actually look at each column, they kind of bow out in the center a little. And this is so from the distance, the human eye still sees them as straight. This also goes for the horizontal lines. So if you're standing at one end of the Parthenon and your buddy's standing at the long side, the other end, it looks like you should be able to see each other. What would actually happen is you wouldn't be able to see each other's feet. It again curves. Why? So if I was standing there and I put a book down, you would not be able to see the book. And again, the reason why the Greeks did this is because they understood how the optical illusion worked, and they wanted everything to appear straight and orderly. Now, this is under reconstruction, and the reason why it's taking so long is basically it's about a 30,000 piece jigsaw puzzle. Every single piece of the Parthenon is completely different. So the restorers have to go find where the pieces go, often have to fill in spots and correct damage of it. And then, if you're interested, along the top, there would have been the friezes, which were relief sculptures, again depicting the greatness of the Greeks on it. Interestingly enough, in the pediment, which is the triangle on the front that you can see here, this depicted the gods and the goddesses. Now, interestingly enough, in the Parthenon, the frieze that went around the building was showing the procession of the Athenian people. And this is important because this was one of the first times we actually see the gods and humans almost on the same level. And many scholars believe this shows that the Greeks were actually showing how they viewed themselves, that they saw themselves almost on the same level as the gods. All right, and then we do have Greek literature at this time. Mostly we focus more on theater, but do know we did have poets. Pindar, probably the most famous of the poets. He was a lyrical poet, and he wrote many odes. An ode is a celebration of an occasion or a public or private event, some sort of dignity. And what happens in them is they employ a blending of emotion and basically general mediation. All right, well then quickly moving on to the Hellenistic style. The Hellenistic style, much less formal, it's more realistic than Greek classicalism, and we're going to see more emotions. And what this shows within the culture is that we're actually beginning to see more of an interest in the individual. So in the Greek sculptures, we would see the form, and again, remember I said it wasn't LeBron, but it's the idealized discus thrower, the idealized lance bearer. Now, what we're actually going to see here in the Hellenistic is we're going to see more emotion, and we would, for the most part, be able to look at the individuals and know who they are. And that is an example in the lower right-hand corner. This is Laocoon and his two sons. This was created in the 1st century CE in marble, and it's about 5 feet. And this is actually located, today it's actually in the Vatican right outside of Rome. And what happens with this also relates to the Trojan War. And the story was when the Greeks go to give the Trojans the Trojan horse, Laocoon knew it was a trick, and he wanted to go warn the citizens of Troy. Well, Poseidon, the god of the sea, did not want him to warn them because he was mad at the Trojans. He wanted the Trojans to lose. So he told Laocoon not to go down and warn them. Well, Laocoon does. He goes and warns them. They don't listen to him anyway. And because of this, Poseidon actually punishes Laocoon, and he sends sea serpents to kill him. But not just him, it's him and his 2 sons. And that's what you see here in the sculpture. Next, we're going to move on to Imperial Roman Classicalism. Now, as I said before, what happens when Greece eventually falls, we're going to see a shift of the cultural world to Rome. And Rome, again, was very, very heavily influenced by Greek classicalism. And you're going to see in sculpture from Rome, we're going to see some of these same ideas. So again, we see this idealized form, but what's interesting is what the Romans would do is they would take that idealized form. So like we see here, this is the Augustus of Prima Porta. We know this is the Emperor Augustus. Well, it's an idealized form, but what they do is they basically kind of stick the emperor's head on it. And then they added Roman clothes. And then you can see here, if you look down to Augustus' left, you see Cupid. Cupid is the son of Venus or Aphrodite. And so what this shows in there is it's actually linking the Roman emperor to the gods. All right, now Roman literature. Literature, what we're going to see is usually they were writing about glorifying the emperor, the origins of Rome, the honesty of rural life, patriotism, glory for dying for one's country were very common themes. Horace, 658 to 8 BCE, was a Latin lyrical poet, often wrote about love, friendship, philosophy, art, and poetry. The odes usually had stanzas of 2 to 4 lines, and usually they're very intimate and reflective. Now, probably the most well-known writer in ancient Rome was Virgil, and Virgil's epic poem, the Aeneid. Now, what happens in the Aeneid is the Aeneid kind of picks up the story of Homer's The Iliad, which was an ancient Greek text, and the Iliad told the story of the Trojan War. Well, what happens in the Aeneid follows the journey of Aeneas. Aeneas was a Trojan warrior, and as you should know, in the Trojan War, Troy lost. The Greeks won with the trickery of the Trojan horse. And what happens is this now follows Aeneas. As Troy is burning to the ground, unfortunately, Aeneas' wife dies, but Aeneas flees Troy carrying his aged father, Anchises, and his young son, Ascanius, which you can see in the bottom right of this image, is also following him. Now, if you look at his father, so he's carrying his father is holding the Lars and the Pentes, which are the household gods of Troy. And the story was there was a prophecy that Aeneas, his father, and his son, and the others that were able to flee Troy, there was a prophecy that they needed to journey and basically find a new place to live. And the prophecy stated that they would know they were in the right place when they were so hungry that they ate their plates. And so the Aeneid follows them around on different adventures. And then finally, unfortunately, the father dies, but he dies of old age. He dies a peaceful death. And then eventually what happens is they get to an area, and the people in the area are feeding them. And what they do is they have a type of bread. And the bread is so solid, you actually put the food on top of the bread. And then as you're done eating, the juices from the food soak into the bread, make it chewable, and then you eat the bread. Well, they finally realize that, oh my goodness, we just ate our plates. And so they knew they were in the area that they needed to be to found their new civilization. Well, this area is modern-day Rome. And so what happens with this story is Virgil is actually linking the greatness of the Roman Empire to the greatness of Greek classicalism. Now, near the end of the Roman Empire, we're going to start to see the rise of Christianity. The Emperor Constantine, who ruled from 306 to 337, was the first emperor who converted to Christianity. In 313 CE, he issued the Edict of Milan, which actually proclaimed toleration of all religions in the Roman Empire. And then eventually he does make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Now, in Rome, architecture is very important. And so what they did is they built on the post and lintel system of the Greeks. But what the Romans actually introduced were two very important things. The first was the use of concrete. Concrete is a mixture of sand, water, glass. You can form it into shapes, and then when it dries, it's very, very sturdy. And the Romans invented what's called the arch. And you can see that very clearly in the building here in the Colosseum. The Colosseum is basically made up of rows of arcades, which are arches next to each other. And this was very important. We'll discuss this more in depth in the architecture chapter, but it's very important because with an arch, you're able to have much wider open spaces. And in fact, think about it, if you put a bunch of arches in a circle together, you actually get a dome. And because of this, you can have a large open area. Again, from the 1st to 4th century, this typical Roman style uses the arch as a structural system, as you see here in the Colosseum. Also, we're going to see the Roman triumphant arches. And what happens in this, again, it's the Roman classical style, and these were often used in memory of the emperor or to celebrate some great victory. So this is the Arch of Constantine. You can see it's got the 3 arches, and then it's decorated with relief scenes that would tell the greatness of the emperor. And then we see the Pantheon. This is in Rome. It was built circa 118 to 28 CE, and this is a temple to the gods. And you can see here we have the dome in the back, and the dome is made up of the arches. Now, with the concrete, they were able to create this massive structure, but you can see it's still got the osuli, which is the open in the middle. And the reason this is open is because they couldn't figure out how to completely close it without it collapsing. If you go to the Pantheon today, it is still open, that oculi. And so if you're there and it's raining, it's going to rain inside the Pantheon.